On June 7, 1892, Homer Plessy, a 1/8 African-American man, was sent by the Citizens Committee to board the East Louisiana Railway first-class train car. Plessy was arrested for violating the Louisiana Separate Car Act, and he filed suit because he believed that this act went against the 13th and 14th Amendments. This action by Homer Plessy ultimately led to a legal definition of the conflict between African Americans who wanted the new rights given during Reconstruction to be returned, and whites in the South who wanted to keep African Americans oppressed through Jim Crow laws. Plessy's case was resolved in the United States Supreme Court with a compromise separate but equal, leading to 50 years of legalized segregation in the United States. This compromise was overturned in 1954 when Brown versus the Board of Education declared separate but equal schools unconstitutional. Following the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction was established. During Reconstruction, Northern troops began to rebuild the South and ensure that African Americans were given equality. A series of civil rights acts were passed during this time to support the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, and 14th Amendment, which gave all U.S. citizens equal rights. These new rights provided African Americans equal access to public facilities and transportation. They protected African Americans in the South and mandated that violators of the Civil Rights Acts be punished. Many white Southern citizens found these laws unsatisfactory. In 1877, President Hayes removed Northern troops from the South, ending Reconstruction. In 1883, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which prohibited discrimination in public facilities and transportation, as unconstitutional. In addition, the court decided that Congress lacked the constitutional authority to enforce the 14th Amendment. As a result, Southerners began to overtly discriminate against African Americans by creating separate facilities for separate races and forming groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, to obliterate the rights of African Americans.
States around the South were denying access on public transportation to Black citizens or, other restrictions, but they weren't challenged in a legal sense. They were just happening and nobody was stopping it from happening.
These events spurred groups of African Americans to oppose the institutionalized segregation. The American Citizens Equal Rights Association was founded by African Americans in 1890 to oppose discriminatory actions throughout the South. The Louisiana branch, known as the Citizens Committee, supported the Reconstruction-era rights given to African Americans. The state of Louisiana passed the Separate Car Act of 1890, which took away transportation rights from African Americans by making them ride in a separate car than white citizens. The Citizens Committee decided to put the constitutionality of the Louisiana Separate Car Act to a test because it went against the 13th and 14th Amendments. In 1891, Daniel Desdunes, a 1/8 African American man, bought a first-class train ticket from New Orleans to Mobile, Alabama, and then seated himself in the white car after informing the conductor that he was an African American. He was arrested on the train for not sitting in the Jim Crow car. Desdunes' case didn't reach the Louisiana Supreme Court because Judge John Ferguson ruled that the law only applied to interstate travel and all charges placed on him were thrown out. In June of 1892, Homer Plessy purchased a train ticket on the East Louisiana Railway from New Orleans to Covington, Louisiana. He boarded the train on a white-only car without struggle because he was not noticeably anything but Caucasian. Before taking his seat, Plessy told the conductor that he was African American. He was arrested on the spot for violating the Louisiana Separate Car Act when he wouldn't move to the Jim Crow car. After this, the Citizens Committee immediately went to work on a stronger case for Plessy than they had for Desdunes. They defended their case to the Criminal Court of New Orleans and were put in front of Judge John Ferguson, the same judge that had dismissed Desdunes' case. The Citizens Committee argued that the Louisiana Separate Car Act violated the 13th and 14th Amendments. They also stated that since interracial marriage was legal in Louisiana, interracial transportation should be legal as well. However, the court still upheld the Separate Car Act. After the district court's decision, Plessy appealed to the Louisiana Supreme Court and then the United States Supreme Court.
The most important impact to me of the Plessy v. Ferguson case was the effort of citizens to come together in an effort to right a wrong that had become a law. Their purpose really to challenge it was not just a local reason to change the law in Louisiana, but to challenge the law across the South, where those laws were hampering business along the lines of transportation.
In 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson case finally reached the U.S. Supreme Court. Throughout the case, the court debated over the rights of African Americans in the South. The majority of the court said that the 13th Amendment didn't apply to the case because the Louisiana Separate Car Act did not imply slavery. They also decided that although the 14th Amendment allowed citizenship to all races, there still could be a distinction made between them. These statements made it clear that there was a general lack of interest in giving rights to African Americans in the South. The decision was almost unanimous, with one lone dissent from Justice John Marshall Harlan. His dissent stated that no race is more entitled than another, and that the Constitution never states that one race has power over the others. Ultimately, the Supreme Court case ended with a compromise in favor of Louisiana, which resulted in the phrase separate but equal. The Supreme Court decision imposed legal segregation on African Americans in the South. Because they proved ineffective, the Citizens Committee disbanded. New Jim Crow laws were created, such as those banning African Americans from going to school with white students, playing baseball with white Southerners, or having the right to own a restaurant. The new phrase, separate but equal, implied that all people would have equal facilities, but they would be divided according to their race. However, many facilities didn't offer equal accommodations for African American citizens. As a result of this oppression, African American activists formed new groups to fight for equality, such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, that picked up the fight the Citizens Committee started. The NAACP, along with other activists, worked to end racial prejudice and ensure equality for minority groups in America.
It's an example that was set by the NAACP when they were formed. Each group recognized members of the Citizens Committee in their efforts to organize much later, and these groups continued to use the pattern of the Citizens Committee in their challenge to Louisiana's separate car law.
However, the majority of public spaces still remained segregated, including public bathrooms, restaurants, train cars, and schools. It became difficult for African Americans to vote or take government positions because unequal access to a quality education left many illiterate, and in some states, reading tests or poll taxes were required to vote. African American children weren't allowed to go to white schools anymore, so new schools were founded solely for African Americans. These schools were poorly funded and weren't provided with the same materials as white schools. In 1952, this inequality was brought before the United States Supreme Court in the case Brown versus the Board of Education, which argued that separate schools were unconstitutional. The case was successful, and the flawed compromise, separate but equal, was overruled.
There was many legal challenges leading up to the Brown v. Board of Ed, and none of them were able to challenge the 14th Amendment in a way that lawyers on the Brown cases were able to prove that separate is never equal.
The case of Plessy versus Ferguson arose out of the ongoing conflict between African Americans and whites after the end of the Civil War. The Citizens Committee challenged the Louisiana Separate Car Act in an attempt to legally prove that the segregation laws were unconstitutional. This case was brought to the United States Supreme Court, but it ruled into law the compromise separate but equal. This judgment spurred half a century of legalized segregation and was not overturned until the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education case. The Plessy versus Ferguson decision wrote into law the belief of many white Americans that the African American race was inferior, paving the way for civil rights cases in the future.
I'm leaving, oh.